To Let's Schmooze. I'm Doug Ebach, the original screenwriter for the movie Sweet Home Alabama. Each month I bring on guests to discuss topics related to writing for various entertainment media. And our topic today is going to be various entertainment media. Today my guests are Anne Toole, a television, video game, and comic book writer, and Scott Marcano, who has written movies, web series, and comic books. So welcome, guys, and thanks for being
here. Thanks for having us, Doug.
Yeah. So I want to start with kind of like the basic question all these start with, which is sort of like, how did you break into the business? And I'll ask Anne the question first for coordination.
Well, I like to use a credit card, and that's usually how I break in. No, so it's always like the boring answer. I was a writer's assistant, and then I got my first freelance scripts that way. And
this is, you were a TV writer initially,
yeah,
right?
I started out in TV, yeah. And then for video games, it's even a less helpful answer because they were looking for people with produced TV credits, which I had at that time. So definitely people will ask me like, well, how do I break into games? And I'm like, break into TV, which is way harder first. I don't know.
And was that, I don't know that much about the video game side of the business. I've worked on one, but was that, and I think kind of early, in that early era, they were mostly hiring writers to do kind of dialogue, or there's probably a video game term for that, but write the dialogue, really not work on the narrative part of it. Is that kind of why they were looking for TV writers?
I think that just in general, games tend to have a feeling of being the redheaded stepchild. I think when Horizon Zero Dawn at Game I worked on won a Writers Guild Award, the head writer literally said, I know we're considered the redheaded stepchild. Like, I think he literally said that on stage. So they definitely look for people who have produced credits in film, TV, comics, novels. So they appreciate people who can put together a story in just about any other medium. While in Hollywood, they'll be like, oh, that's nice that you do that other stuff. Prove you can do it in our medium first. But I can't really hate on that because it makes a lot of sense. I should say with comics, arguably comics was the hardest thing to break into. And I was like, I wrote specs of comics and like, I was going to Comic-Con every year. And I was like, I'm working as a writer. Why can't I break in here? And oddly enough, like my first comic came out of, they were fans of, the Lizzie Bennett Diaries. There were more of the Vlogbrothers who were executive producing it. So that's kind of how, like, I wouldn't have thought like do an Emmy-winning web series and you will work in comics, but that's what happened.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing is success kind of breeds success, and so Scott, why don't you tell us? So did you start in feature films? Is that kind of the first place you?
Yeah, I started in feature films. I was actually at USC Film School in the graduate program, and I was in the last semester of the program. I'd already done. They had a thing called at that time called a 480, where they paid for you to do like a 30-minute film, and I directed that. And I was sort of just finishing up my last classes, and this writer, Rich Wilkes, who wrote Airheads and had a big deal going at Disney at the time, called me up. He was a good friend at the time, and he called me up and he said, there's some guys over at Fox. They got a little project. It's beneath me. Essentially, it pays no money. It pays $600, but if you want to just cut your teeth, and write a script, I'll send them your number. And I actually at that point had never written a script. The project I had done at USC was somebody else's script that I had directed. I was really geared towards being a director at that point. But they gave me the treatment and I read it, and it turned into the treatment for Biodome, and they paid me $600, which I split with a friend of mine, the guy who had written my 480, because he was a better writer than me at that point. I'd never written anything. But I figured I knew how to tell a story pretty well. So we just dove in there and just started doing it. And I was like, great, pizza money. This, I got a little money, in my pocket for a few months. That's great. And then it just kept going, and they kept pushing it. And eventually, Endeavor picked it up as a spec they wanted to send around. And then Motion Picture Corp got involved in it. And then next thing I know, MGM was doing it. And so that little $600 job turned into a $90,000 payday. And then we ended up selling a bunch more stuff. And then, yeah, it's funny, a funny story, because Tom Strickler was the agent. He was representing them, the producers, Mitch Peck and Adam Leff, who were on it. And he read the script. He said, it's funny, but he had like no interest in representing me. I asked him, I said, would you represent me? I know you're sitting around the script. He's like, oh, no. I'm representing them. I'm like, okay, great. After we sold it, then we got offered another deal from Disney. Then he called me up because he heard UTA, was interested in signing me at that point. And then he was like, I will cut your balls off if you don't sign with me. I was your biggest fan. You cannot betray me. Threatened my life. And so I basically said, okay, I'll sign with you, Tom. And I ended up in Endeavor.
I completely want someone to say that to me now. Like, I think someone got to me first.
Yeah, forget the whining and dining. The threats are what really when you overdo it.
Trying to castrate you. Yeah. Where's the charm? Where's the schmooze?
That's the guy I want. Yeah. I found out we were negotiating a deal, and I found out the attorneys for the other producers called my attorney the bitch. That was their nickname for her, and I was like, that is awesome. And I told her, and she was like, that is awesome. Like that's the person you want repping you. So I have to point out too, by the way, you're wearing the wrong T-shirt if you were at the USC film school.
It's a long story, but essentially my dad and my mom and my stepmother all went to UCLA. So I was brainwashed from a young age to root for UCLA and only UCLA, and to hate SC. So it's kind of a joke in our family. I never went to UCLA, but we had season tickets to every one of their sports, throughout my life. And so even though I was at SC, I was basically a secret UCLA, secret Bruin, always rooting for UCLA and putting curses on the SC football team from the parking lot structure and the whole bit. So it's kind of funny. One day I actually stuck a USC film school sticker on the bumper of his car, and he threatened to have the bumper removed.
Yeah, there's a bit of a rivalry there. Yeah.
Yep.
I did 482, by the way, but I was a cinematographer at that point in my.
Oh, very cool.
So, yeah. So then my career took a whole different turn. So
it's funny. I started off wanting to direct, and I ended up, making a career as a writer and publisher and all this other stuff. So.
Well, yeah, and so kind of what I want to talk about today most is like this moving from different kind of genres, from for like Anne, moving from television to video games to comic books, and Scott. So maybe you can tell us, Scott, like how you went from you're doing movies, and I know you mostly as a comic book publisher and author, a writer who has a little publishing thing, and I see you at Comic-Con every year with your booth. Do you want to talk about how that transition happened?
Yeah, it was it kind of happened by chance. I mean, I was always into comics. I used to do comics when I was in high school. I used to hand draw my own little comics. That's how I started as a storyteller. And I was too dumb to get a copy machine, so I would actually draw the individual comics over and over again and make these little stories. And I'd put a little piece of gum in it, and I'd try to sell it to my friends for $1. And I think they just felt sorry for me, so they bought them. So I always had this love of comics, and I always collected them, but I was so focused on film. But there came a point when I had all these scripts laying around that people weren't buying. And I was like, I like these stories. I think they really work. And so I took one of them, a story called The Unwanted, and I thought it was a horror story about a bunch of kids who are stuck in a juvenile detention center, and they're all like the bad kids. You find out that they have a reason why they're bad. They're from the streets and stuff. But they get locked in this juvenile detention center, and their principal gets possessed by this demon, this ancient demon, and starts hunting them. But they're the bad kids, so they start fighting back. And my pitch on it was like, it's the Breakfast Club meets The Exorcist. You'll love it. But everybody rejected it. So I was like, all right, whatever. So I finally said, what, maybe I should do this as a comic. So I approached some friends of mine, and I said, you want to invest in this? We can be partners, and I'll see if I can put it together. And, they liked the idea. So I got some investors, to come together and give me some money. And we basically just did it on our own. I hired an artist, and I had no real expectation of doing anything that big with it. I was really just trying to create individual issues at first that I could just take to a bigger company like Marvel or DC or Image, or Top Shelf. And I thought maybe they'd like it. So I started to create it, and I had created like 2 or 3 issues of it. And I got a table. You could still get a table at Comic-Con at that point, surprisingly enough. And it wasn't that hard. Yeah. And I got a table, and I had that's all I had was just the table. There was nothing else but 3 issues of this comic. And I was just sitting there. And I went up to the Marvel and DC people at the show and said, "Are you interested?" And I got kind of one of these. Great, whatever. We don't really care. And I was like, okay, well, shoot, so I had it on the table and I was trying to selling them for $1 or whatever. I'll make a little bit of money to pay for the table. And this guy came up and he's, and he was from Diamond, which is, the distributor. And he said, I love this. He said, complete it as a graphic novel. Do this one cover you have, like of issue number 3, that had this demon on it. It was really cool. And he said, and we will take it out. And so I had this epiphany, you know what? Just start your own company. Just do your own thing. Instead of begging people to like your stuff, see if you can just do it yourself. And so we did. We powered through and got the Unwanted done as a complete graphic novel. And I took it to Diamond, and it sold really well. So I was like, okay, great. So I was able to get other investors and to do and start doing other books and partnering with people. And Diamond was very happy because I was hitting all my benchmarks on everything. So that ended up just becoming my, starting my own comic book company. And then funny enough, I took that same script back to the same, with the graphic novel. And I had Tom Strickler send the graphic novel to the same producers who rejected the script and say, oh, look what Scott's doing now. He's doing this graphic novel. And I literally got calls like, this is great. Why did you ever show me this? This is wonderful. And Tom would be like, they rejected the fucking script 6 months ago, the fucking idiots. And so it was funny. I ended up optioning that several times. And, so it's just funny, it's just seeing an individual medium, all of a sudden they got it, and saw that it would work and they were interested in it. So it's funny how it works full circle.
I think that happens. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, go ahead. I was kind of done.
Yeah, I think that I don't want to say names because I don't necessarily have permission to tell this story, but I also have a friend that had this sort of the same experience. He was an established television writer. He had written this pilot script that his agent wouldn't even send out. So he did it as a graphic novel. And then like a year later, it's a series on a cable channel because it was a graphic novel. And he kind of told me, he's like, it sold less than 1,000 copies as a graphic novel. And yet just the fact that it was as a graphic novel, now suddenly they wanted to make it as a television show. So
I don't know if that's still the case, that you could get away with just 1,000.
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh yeah, now they call you up and you're absolutely right, Anne. They call you up now and it's like, they ask for the hard numbers. You have to show them what you actually did. They want sales figures from Diamond or other places to prove you do it. And it's funny, I had one book. It wasn't The Unwanted. It was a different book that somebody hired me to actually write, and I owned a percentage of it. And I gave it to like a producer, one of the producers on Biden, and I told him the numbers. I said, oh yeah, this sold like 7,000 copies. And he's like, oh, New York Times bestseller. Oh, God. Well, yeah, so things have changed. They really do care about how much you've actually sold it these days.
Yeah, and this is sort of going a little off topic, but I've heard in the comic book industry a lot of times it's social media followers. Like if you're pitching a book to someone, they want to know like, well, how many people follow you on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. Like that's kind of, you need to show some numbers before that you can bring some audience to the table there, which I'm not sure is great for the business, but kind of the reality. So, and Anne, you said you were interested in getting into comics for a long time, and then it sounds like, I don't want to say you fell into it, but you sort of came into it in a way like you didn't go out to pitch something, you sort of got asked to do it, right? So what was that process like transitioning?
Well, I actually had almost two comics go at the same time after like trying to get in for ages. And I was, at Comic-Con, I would walk the floor and I would, I wore my Writers Guild hat that said writer on it. And I had a pin that said, that had a speech bubble and you could write in whatever you want. And I wrote in, hire me. I was not subtle at all. So I did that, year after year and, just couldn't get any traction. Even sometimes when I was working on an IP that like, I work on this IP, you're making the comic of the IP. Like, why can't you, why is this not happening? But yeah, I had been going to this company, Zenoscope, a lot and just connecting with them. And one of their editors, I guess, I think he'd heard about that I was working on Lizzie Bennett. I don't know exactly, but he was a fan of the Vlogbethers and their message of, dare to be awesome and stuff like that. And, the head of the company knew me because I was coming by every year. And so I think that was the combo that made that happen. And also at the same time, Lionforge was launching and they were looking for writers. So I reached out to them on LinkedIn and I basically inundated them with comic book samples like that I'd written. You know, I was like, I wrote, you know, because I'd worked on a game that had comic book sequences in it just to, you know, keep things on the cheap. And so I was like, look, I've done it professionally and here's my spec. And so I just like inundated, like basically exactly what you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to send like 1 or 2 of your best. And I was like, here's everything. You will like it. Anyway, so then I was chosen to work on one of their comics, which is Crystal Cadets. Yeah, right here. So that pretty much almost happened at the same time. And it was kind of 2 different ways, but it was definitely after much pain and consternation. And I definitely, they do have agents for like, you know, illustrators and comic book artists. And I would go up to them and be like, hey, do you take writers? And I remember one guy's like, I really don't know how writers break in. I think you just have beer with the editors or something like that. I'm like, okay, I'm not having a beer with any editor. So that's going to be a problem. Yeah.
Well, and I definitely heard in the comic book business that you have to get an artist to draw some panels, that people really don't look at scripts. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well,
and I
original stuff. Yeah. But it doesn't have to be a lot. Like I did walk the floor one time with an artist because we were thinking about doing something, and they were like, just give us the first 5 pages of, you know, your magnum opus, your 120, you know, graphic novel. And all I needed is the first 5 pages to make the decision. So I was like, oh, that's a lot better than doing the entire thing. So
Yeah, I did that too, and you know, Scott, you were talking about like going to Marvel and DC. I feel like at Comic-Con, Marvel and DC is not really interested in talking to you. I don't know, maybe
they think you're just a fan. They want to move you over to the merchandise.
Right, go to the store. Yeah. But I found that some of the smaller publishers really were great and willing to sit down. And we even talked to I got to, you know, give a shout out to the heavy metal guys, because our thing was totally wrong for them, but my artist was a big fan, and so he's like, well, I just want to go pitch it to them anyway. And they're like, yeah, your thing is totally wrong, but come sit down. And he was giving my artist like pointers on his art and like they're really cool. So yeah, I think if you definitely go to Comic-Con, right, if you want to break into comics. That's like the #1 rule. But so I'm curious. Well, actually, so then Scott, let me ask you about, because now you're doing this. What do you call it, a web series? The Nancy Hernandez and the Black Widows.
Yeah, we decided that we wanted to take some of our stuff to the next level. You know, so what we started doing is taking our graphic novels and breaking them down and turning them into an animated series. So we started with Nancy Hernandez, which is and the Black Widows, which is our bestseller. And it's very popular too. With, you know, I do a lot of high school presentations where I go and I talk to entire high schools all over the country about, you know, graphic novels and, you know, and reading and getting involved in manga and stuff like that. So that book was really popular with that crowd because it's about a high school haunting. So we just started taking the book and basically just animating it. And so now we're also bringing on students as interns to help with the animation. So, and it's going well. We really love the results of it so far.
Cool. Great. Okay. So then the other part of this, and by the way, people can find that on the website, which is it DiabloComics.com? Do I have that? Okay. Yeah. Diablo Comics.
They can also they can search for it. If you search for it on YouTube, it'll come right up.
Yeah.
All the episodes.
And I'll put that link in the show notes. So, okay. So the other thing I want to discuss is, you know, writing for these different forms. They're different, right? And just like format, but also, you know, what you have to do as a writer changes depending on these media. So, so Scott, why don't you first talk about, like, how did you learn to write? Well, you said you were drawing comics when you were a kid, so maybe by osmosis, but you started with the feature film script and you got into film school, and then you were starting to write comics. How did that process change? What's the difference?
I mean, technically you should change it, right? And you should consider things like in your script, like page turns, which is a big deal to a lot of people. Like, you know, you don't want to have like your big reveal moment happen at the bottom of a page. You want to have it when the page is turned, ideally. And if you can make that happen, you want to specify it in the script and think about the pacing, like how many, and sort of get into page counting a little bit to say, okay, I know I'm going to be on a page turn here, or there's going to be a splash page here. You have to start thinking that way, and you have to start thinking a little bit in panels. I don't do it as much as I should. I tend to write scripts that could work as a film or work as a comic book, right? So I don't tweak the script that much for the artists that work for me. And unfortunately, the people who work for me are they don't yell at me too much when I just hand them a script, and it's like, dude, it's like a film script, and I'm like, I know, but you know what to do. They usually figure it out without a lot of fuss. There are times when they'll pull me aside and say, splash page, Scott, page turn here. Do you want a panel here? What are you asking for? And I'll have to break it down. And I've tried to get better about that, like specifying the script to be a comic book script, not just a film script, because the format is almost identical, except in terms of its actual formatting, it looks pretty much the same. So it's easy to fall into just handing people scripts, but technically you should try to really think about how it's going to look, how it's going to play as somebody reads through a script. You don't want to have the best moment, the big reveal of the bad guy or the big dramatic moment happen right in the middle of the page. You want it to be a turn and like, oh my God, that's what happened. Oh, that's great. So you do have to think about that. That's the biggest thing that I think that that you need to do. And again, it's not rocket science. If you hand most artists a regular film script without any changes, they will interpret it really accurately and really well. They know what they're doing most of the time. The artists I encounter, you occasionally meet somebody that's no idea, but a lot of people know exactly what to do, and they will illustrate it very well based on what you wrote and on the page. So I'm not encouraging screenwriters just to say, yeah, just take your script and hand it to them. Don't make a single change, but you can do that. And I've gotten away with it. Most of the time, you'll get away with it. But as you get better, or if you really want to help the artist really bust it out and make it the way you really want it, I think you really have to think about that specifically. And you also have to think about something too, although this is true of film, but I think especially true of comics, you got to make it visual. It's got to be in the action lines. It cannot be all this dialogue, because you ever see a comic book where they talk for an entire Quentin Tarantino page of a bubble that goes on for the entire page? It doesn't happen. And in film, you could get away with a monologue like that, or stage, right? Obviously, comic books, you got to keep that really keep an eye on that dialogue and keep it smaller and just get to your points and move along so that the book moves, because the visuals are telling you so much on the page already. I think even more than film, you really got to, at least for me, I mean, Anne might feel differently about it, but I try to keep my dialogue a little shorter in when I do a comic book, just because I know the reading. And think about your readers, teenagers, young adults are a huge part of your market. Well, depending on the book you write, but that's a big part of the market I write for. They don't want to read a monologue that goes on for that long. They're reading a comic book so they don't have to read as much. So they want it short and they want to get to the point. And so you got to keep your dialogue snappy and quick and in and out. I think that's my general sort of principles that I operate on and how it's different from film.
Alan Moore would like to disagree with you.
I know. And he's a genius and he's great, and Neil Gaiman too. If you can get away with it, go for it. But again, those guys have a certain cachet. Like, when you read Alan Moore, you're like, okay, I know I'm reading this genius. And if he wants to talk for a whole page and have Swamp Thing pontificate about the nature of the universe, I'll read it.
Yeah, I feel like Walking Dead has a little bit of that too. Although it's interesting because then it will have just pages with almost no dialogue. But there's sometimes where there's like a conversation. It's just like you just see the heads repeated, and there's like the dialogue between them. It's just a whole page of just why even draw, right? Like just like the dialogue.
Just hire the letterer. There's a lot of people.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Scott, that you have an unfair advantage writing comics because you come out of directing, but it sounds like you don't like. So when I write comics, I call every panel, and that was largely because I never knew the artists I'd be working with, so I didn't know like how good a visual storyteller they would be because I had no idea who it was. So I would do that, and I took a storyboarding class at the Animation Guild. So that was kind of helpful. But I haven't really had like formal like directing training. So I find it can be pretty challenging because I'm like, I have to it's like calling every shot, right? And it definitely requires some forethought. So yeah, I was going to say, it's like, it's not fair. You've actually gotten training to do it. So
I think I also look out for the reason that you just mentioned, Dan, is that I'm actually hiring the people that I'm working with, and I know them well, and I work with the same people for a long, like Juan Romero, who does a lot of illustrations for me. I mean, I've worked with Juan for 15 years. We have a shorthand with each other. If I was handing it off to strangers who I couldn't talk to and I didn't know, I probably would be a lot more this panel this panel that. Don't screw it up. And it's just a different situation because I have this dialogue going. If I turn something in and they don't get it, they'll just call me or write me and say, Scott, what do you want here? They'll correct me or tell me, or we can really discuss it. It's not going into a blind void where I'm like, oh God, when I get a finished comic from another company, I'm like, that's not what I wanted. I have control of it, which gives me a big advantage.
Yeah, I very rarely like have ever like seen. I would not be able to pick out of a lineup any of the artists, and a couple of the artists I only met like on Zoom, basically, like after the comic came out. So I'm always like, after this very important promotional video, can I talk to the artist and see if he needs anything from the because I don't have any direct contact with him. So it's always like, am I doing okay? So, you know, because I don't want to be too heavy-handed. I want them to be free to do their art. But, yeah.
So was the process, Anne, for you really like you wrote it and handed it off and then you got back finished pages, or was there any there's no back and forth?
I mean, so I worked through the editors, and that's great because the editors obviously know what they're doing. And so I, you know, send the script, we go through obviously revisions, and then they send it off to the artist, and then the artist sends pencils usually, or thumbnails. One project I worked on, we got very detailed pencils, so I felt really bad about like, can we change this entire page? Because I was like, hopefully that's a fast artist and it's not a big deal. But yeah, so yeah, then I would give feedback on that, and then, you know, then we get inks, then we get colors, then we get, you know, lettering and stuff like that. So just giving notes on all of that. Sometimes I wouldn't have the opportunity to give all those notes. Sometimes I would. It just depended on the process and I guess the deadline.
Yeah, when I tried to do, or I'm just still trying to do, Scott, you said it, a pitch for a comic book, and I was working with an artist to do you know, the proposal, and I wrote out my script in panels like you're talking about, but I told the artist, I said, like, it's just because I don't have a good sense of what the pace on a page is. Like, I need to figure out what you can actually do on a page. And I'm like, if you don't like my layout, like, make your own layout. Like, I don't care. I'm not saying I know better than the artist how to do the layout, but I was like, I just have to do this for my own, you know, understanding of what actually I'm going to see.
Yeah,
I tend to do the same thing, Doug. I tend to default a lot to the expertise of the people I work with, because they're very experienced. And, you know, if you understand that, I trust them, that they understand the pacing of the story. And if they want to move things a little slower, or they feel like a splash page is necessary, or just 3 panels, however they feel like it's going to play the best, I have enormous amount of faith that they're going to pull it off. And I try not to over direct them. I try to stick to, like, I'm worried about the story, I'm worried about the overall look, you know, but, you know, and if they do something where I'm just like, what are you doing? I don't get this, you know, I'll tell them. But that's rare. Usually they're really good at figuring it out, you know, better than I would if I was pointing out every single panel. But again, I'm in a different situation than you, Anne. I mean, because you have to hand it in blind, you know, to an editor, and then also it gets interpreted. It's a little removed because I have that one-on-one relationship with the artist. You know, we developed a shorthand, and it's very easy for me to have faith that they will put the correct pace in to keep it going. And I've never had any complaints really, except on one book I had, and it was because the person who hired me to do the book was really trying to dictate it, and the pace was way off, you know, and there was nothing we could say because they were essentially funding the book. So, but that's the only case where I had where, you know, customers came back and said, you know, what's going on with this book? It's not like your other ones. And I was like, yeah, no.
Yeah, so that kind of also brings up an interesting difference between writing in different media, is the relationship of the writer and the process changes a lot. And so, Anne, I want to hear some about the video game process, both like what you do as a writer, like what the requirements of the job are, and then also kind of your role in that process, which I imagine changes game to game quite a bit. But do we just talk about that a little?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, the number one question I always get is, well, how do you write a game? And I would say backwards and in high heels. I'm kidding. But it's different every time, and people don't necessarily like that answer. But yeah, if you've played a variety of games, you've seen that there's like a variety of ways to tell the story. Some games are text only, some have text with some animation, some are full performance capture, some have branching, some don't rather. And so it definitely varies on the process. And I get a lot of people in the game industry being like, well, what do you specialize in? Like, do you specialize in like story, or do you like specialize in dialogue? And, coming from, entertainment, I was like, how would you possibly specialize that way? Like, you have to do the whole thing. Like, you just write you come with the story, you write the script. So I always thought that was pretty odd, that there are people who specialize. But I've also done pen and paper RPGs. So doing like world building, basically chapters of source books and stuff like that, which is it's basically like writing a very detailed Bible for a film or TV show or something like that. And so it can definitely vary. Sometimes I'm brought in early on a project, so I'm helping coming up with the story. And sometimes you're brought in kind of late for a variety of reasons. They had, they need to ship and they need more writers. Like what the infamous thing is the narrative medic. They've made a lot of cuts and now their story makes no sense, and so they need somebody to come in and kind of like save the story. And there's this feeling that like that's only really in games where that happens. But I remember hearing Steve D'Souza talk about how he was basically like rewriting Die Hard while they were shooting, and that's not unusual. That like these rewrites are happening while things are going on. I heard like with Shrek, the original Shrek, the gingerbread scene, like that was the last thing added. It didn't go through like the 30,000 rewrites, and so that's one of the more recent additions to that script. So it's really interesting. You think, oh, that's only in games where that happens, but it actually happens in every medium. It's just not well known, I guess.
Well, yeah, there's the famous story, in The Shining. Kubrick was rewriting that script so often and so many times. Jack Nicholson was in his trailer, and I think somebody came in. They came to check. They gave him a script. They came back, and they, like an hour later, have you learned your lines, Jack? And Nicholson was like, "What's the point? It'll change by noon." I mean, so yeah, I mean, I think they wrote that script like 100 times. It depends on the situation, but yeah. I think people think like, that it is video games or something like that. But no, I mean, it just depends on the person in charge of the product. And yeah, I've been on film sets where they're changing the script every friggin' day.
Well, and it as it happens, the last of these podcasts, the last episode, I had an editor and a writer director on talking about how they changed the story in post-production. So, even after you shot, like, and it was that kind of thing. It's like, well, you cut some stuff out. Like, now how do we make this make sense? Or something didn't work on the set, and like, so now we have to figure out a solution. Or just I think in that film particularly, there was a pacing issue that read well on the page, but then they got into the cut, and it's like, we have to rearrange because of what you discover. And I remember the famous Silence of the Lambs, when they had the whole thing where Jodie Foster talks about where the screaming of the lambs, like they had shot a whole flashback of her as a little girl doing that, but then they got the cut and they're like, we can't cut away from her face. Like her performance is so amazing. Like, so throw that flashback out, because you discover things as you go. So,
well, supposedly, I mean, that's why, not to offend anybody, but supposedly that's why, the new Star Wars, movies were such a mess in terms of, if you really follow the threads of the story, that doesn't make a lot of sense, is because they finished the last one and they showed the cut to Bob Iger and he's like, I want Palpatine. And they're like, well, we never set that up. And they had to go basically and make this ridiculous storyline at the end where Palpatine, even he got thrown over by Vader and the whole thing blew up on top of it. Somehow he escaped all that and is now reincarnated and has this whole weird thing of, I'm going to put all this Sith in you. It makes no sense, but it was because, in post, all of a sudden it's, no, I want this character. So let's go reshoot. Try to reinvent the whole thing at the end of 3 movies.
Yeah, development is weird. I had a director friend who had been animation, and she'd been working on a project. She wasn't directing it, but she'd been working on a project, and like we saw a screening, and she kind of said at one point, she's like, "Oh, that's a setup for a joke that got cut out," and like the setup never got cut from the thing, and it just, because stuff changes so much, it's so hard to keep track.
Oh yeah.
So great. So this, I think, has been informative. I'm sure we could talk a lot more about it. But why don't you tell us a little bit, Anne? I think you said you have a game coming out today. What is that?
Yeah, so I worked on Ghost of Tsushima actually came out last year, but the director's cut comes out today. So by the time you've seen it, you should have already played it. I'm just kidding. But I worked on the director's cut, which involves the expansion into Iki Island. So I was one of the writers who worked on that. And I also have the Horizon Zero Dawn comics coming out. This is Liberation #2. #1 came out last month, or no, earlier this month. So this will come out next month.
Cool.
That's a great video game, by the way. Really cool.
Yeah, I worked on the game as well as the comic. So that was the ideal scenario where it's like I'm working on the game and also the comic. It doesn't always work that way.
And Scott, so you have the web series is kind of your new the animated series is kind of your new thing.
Yeah, we have some more comics coming out there in development, but yeah, Nancy Hernandez and the Black Widows, which started off as this graphic novel, in the web series is our big push in comics, In film, I got a couple other things going. I got a movie with Lucy Hale that's going to go into production at the end of the year that we're really excited about. So, yeah, we're working a lot, at writing a lot of film, doing the comic book thing, and I just got back from Florida. I did the MegaCon, and my nose is actually bruised because I had my N95 mask just like on my face, like I was in the ER with COVID patients. Because Florida's crazy, but I did the show. I did 4 days of it. And
I was going to say,
really well
Florida.
in the middle of Florida, but they masked up the entire hall, and it went well. I came, I'm vaccinated too, but I came back. I'm fine, and the show was great. It was very successful. So it'll be interesting to see if the comic book conventions come back, because MegaCon was kind of the first show that said we're just going to go for it because it's Florida, and it's just the Wild West out there. They don't care, but they pulled off the show. I give them credit. They pulled it off, and it wasn't some giant, so far, not some giant crazy outbreak. They had it really under control, and it was a great show for everybody. So it'll be interesting to see if all these conventions come back. It'll be wonderful because I do shows all over North America with my company Diablo Comics, and I'd love to get back to doing that. It's really fun.
Let me actually, so if I may hold you on and ask you a question about that you weren't prepared for, is Comic-Con. Well, I mean, all the cons, but I know, like, Anne, so I saw I watched your panel on video game writing that you were on for the Comic-Con at home, which, by the way, I got to say is great that Comic-Con did that, right? Like that they for 2 years now, they've basically done a just free, all the panels online, they did their whole thing and it's free, and any, kind of a lot more access than you can normally get to Comic-Con. But Scott, did you participate in any of that? Any of the Comic-Con at home?
Yeah, they did. They had to set up a whole website for whatever your company was. If you're if you do Comic-Con, you would actually basically create like a portal within the Comic-Con online thing, so that all your products were available for people to come on and buy. And people did it. They came on, they bought my products. I mean, it was not the same as being there live, in terms of the numbers, but it was, people were able to access my books and other products we sell and buy them. So it worked out. And the panel I actually do the Christianity and God and comics panel. Even though I'm Diablo, I don't know why they bring me into that. I guess to get the dark side of this opinion.
You're the villain on the panel?
I'm the villain on the panel. They asked me to come, but they didn't want to do the live panel this year. I said I would. If they wanted to do it live, I'd make the time. But for whatever reason, they said, nah, we like to do this live. So we'll wait till they go back to being regular Comic-Con, and then we'll do it. But It's great that they're doing it. I really admire the guys like Rob Mohica and the rest of the guys over there are really good about during this pandemic, about keeping Comic-Con going and engaging with the fans and not letting it die as an experience, which a lot of shows did. They just shut down. Just forget it, talk to us in 2 years. But Comic-Con's been very good about reaching out to their fan base and the people who exhibit and saying, listen, let's keep this going. People still want this. They need this stuff during the pandemic. I mean, maybe now more than ever, they need this entertainment and they need this creative outlet. So let's not lose that. It keeps our sanity.
Yeah. So any good, I'll ask 2 questions. You can pick what you want to talk about. Any good tips for someone going to Comic-Con once it comes back live, and any good Comic-Con stories?
You want to go first, Dan?
Yeah, I guess the tip for me, well, what I do, I've gone a billion times. So every year I try to do something different than I did like the year before. And I think one of my favorite experiences was walking the floor with a development exec. And we were actually looking for a non-genre project. And there is the stereotype of comics is that it is very sci-fi fantasy horror, and it's really true at Comic-Con. So I think that's really interesting, is really getting a sense of literally how many IPs are on that floor and how many of them are genre, and how it's kind of an opportunity to do non-genre stuff, because of course comics is a genre, is a medium, not a genre. So there obviously you can do murder mysteries. I mean, we've seen so many famous comics that are not genre at all, but like, there could be more. So I think that's kind of interesting, just to get an idea of what's out there. And I think it's a great opportunity to do that. Fun stories. Well, I don't know. I love, like I said, I love walking the floor. I've gone into this thing where getting the free promos, so like running around and trying to like grab the promos, that's kind of entertaining for me personally. And of course, all the parties at night, which are a challenge to get into. So that can be cool. So I don't know if those are great stories, but those are things that pop to mind.
Yeah, I will say that one thing that I always feel like when I go to Comic-Con is that the amount of properties, right? And Scott, maybe you also something to say about this, being as someone who has a booth and tries to sell product, like your mind, I just sort of glaze over, and your mind gets numb to just like another superhero on a cover, and like a guy with a cape on a cover, all strong. Like there's just so much of it, and it just kind of drives home. Yeah, you got to find some way to stand out and not be what everybody else is, because when you see it all in one place like that, it is staggering how much content there is. Scott, do you have a comment?
Yeah, for just advice at Comic-Con, one of everything that Anne's saying is spot on. Is that it's really easy to fall into the typical superhero thing. But I think that when people ask me about Comic-Con, I always say, spend your time in Artist Alley and small press, because you could go to DC and Marvel, but what are you going to see there? I mean, you might see the Thor's throne room, or they have those displays, and it's really easy to get sucked into that. And I'm going to spend 10 hours here, so or the Hasbro booth, so I could maybe get this ticket for like this, for some product they're selling. But to me, really, what the great thing of Comic-Con is try to go back to its roots. The most creative part of Comic-Con is not all that. That's just people hyping big IPs that you're going to see anyway. It's not hard to see that. You'll get fed that, with a fire hose, just if you're online ever. Go to small press and go to Artist Alley, because that's where you're going to see the real creativity. People who are taking chances and risks and doing things that are different, like you said, non-genre. And you're going to discover gems there that you don't normally find, because they don't have this giant machine of marketing behind them to let you know. It's somebody who's come up with a cool little comic. It may be personal. It may be, something that's just unique. Or it's even a unique artistic product. It doesn't have to be a book. It can be something they've created, and you will find it there. And I think that's where you should spend your time. And that's where Comic-Con really started, which was that kind of stuff. And it's still there, and take advantage of it. Don't just go to the big stuff that everybody's running to like a herd. Go to those smaller areas, and you'll really find some great stuff that you take home and cherish. And you'll discover artists that are, that you can actually talk to. I mean, how many times you go to DC, are you really going to talk to that artist? They're going to be on a panel, and you're going to be at the back of Hall H going, but if you go to Artist Alley, you can talk to the artist who you like, every year, and they'll engage with you. And I think that's a very valuable experience. My one funny story about Comic-Con, it relates to how I got on that Christian or Christianity and arts panel. One of the first years I was there at Diablo Comics, for whatever reason, they stuck me next to the Christian Comic Arts Society booth. And they actually talked to those guys ahead of time. I found out later, they're like, is it okay if we put you next to Diablo Comics? Is that going to offend you? And they were like, no, I guess it's okay. But it turned out the guy running the booth, Ralph Miley, is like the sweetest guy on the history of the planet. But he's a little mischievous. And the first year I was next to him, he was doing this crap where people were walking by the booth, like just doing their thing. And he was like shooting them with rubber bands and paper clips. And when they would turn around and be all like, aggro, what's going on? He'd be like, Diablo Comics right there. What do you think did that to me? And I kept getting people yelling at me. I was like, will you stop it? Who thinks I'm guilty because I'm the devil? Will you knock it off? And then we became great friends. And then he eventually asked me to start doing his panel with him. So that's one of my favorite stories from Comic-Con. It just ended up being an odd friendship because we were stuck next to each other. But we're great friends to this day.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you guys so much for doing this. And hopefully see you at conventions and things post-pandemic.
For sure.
And thank all of you for joining us. Remember, the 4th edition of the Hollywood Pitching Bible, a book I co-wrote with producer Ken Aguado, is now available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and anywhere else you buy books. Finally, if you like what you heard, please subscribe by clicking the button to the lower right. I hope you'll join us next month for more schmoozing about writing.